Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Thank you for joining us today for the event like Cooking Plov with Hoja Nasreddin. This year, 2021, we're marking the 30th anniversary of the collapse of the USSR. And here at the Davis Center, created to study the Soviet space, we couldn't miss this opportunity to have a closer and fresher look at how it functioned and why it came to an end. There are many aspects, questions to consider, and one of them is the political economy of relations between the center and republics. For our program on Central Asia, Central Asian republics are obviously in focus. And it is not secret that Central Asian republics till the very end wanted to stay in the Union. They were among the most agreeable participants in the process of the development of the new Union Treaty. And that these were actually parts of the Russian elites who wanted to shed Central Asia, seeing it as a burden hindering Russia's development. At the same time, a parallel discourse in Central Asia emphasized the exploitation of the region's resources. So what was actually going on? Today we have an excellent panel with us to shed light on this issue or a set of issues. We have Isaac Scarborough, who is a historian of the Soviet Union and post-Soviet space, studying various aspects of the socio-economic development in Central Asia, Russia, and Ukraine. Isaac received a PhD in international history from the London School of Economics in 2018, and is currently a postdoctoral research fellow in the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at Liverpool John Moores University. Welcome, Isaac. And we also have with us Gregory Gleason, who is Professor Emeritus at the University of New Mexico, and who is currently Professor of Security Studies at the George Marshall Center, which is a partnership between the German Ministry of Defense and the US Department of Defense. He works primarily on the political economy of the countries of the former USSR. During 2018-2019, Dr. Gleason served in Tashkent as the US advisor to the Ministry of Defense in Uzbekistan. He completed his PhD in political science at the University of California at Davis in 1984. And as a preparation for this event, I read Dr. Gleason's book, Federalism and Nationalism, The Struggle for Republican Rights in the USSR, that was published in the early 90s. Yes, it was first published actually in 1990, and it's an excellent book. And I think it's really, really worth reading this book or reading for those who already had the chance to read it earlier. Okay, without further ado, let me give the mic to Isaac. Isaac, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nargis. And let me say a big thank you to you and the organizers and everyone at the Davis Center. I quite appreciate the opportunity to present some of my research and for the chance to have a broader discussion about what some of it may mean, both about the collapse of the USSR and the structure of the USSR before its collapse, in particular the center-periphery relations between Moscow and the Central Asian republics. Before I start, I do want to say I'm going to try very hard to stick to about 20 minutes. The material is somewhat technical, but I'm also going to avoid a lot of the statistical and technical aspects of the paper under discussion and try to focus more on the narratives and sort of the implications of the material that I've been able to find. And I'm very happy, of course, to discuss other aspects of it during the discussion or Q&A thereafter. But if I seem to leave out certain, say, statistical steps in the process, I apologize in advance, but it's simply in for the purposes of being brief and hopefully cogent throughout. So I have a brief presentation that I will share, which hopefully will make this a bit more interesting than just my speaking. So as Nari's very helpfully pointed out, the presentation is called Light Cooking Plov with Hoja and Nasreddin, and I'm looking at how to calculate Soviet-era monetary transfers to, and it should be said from as well, but we'll get to that in a moment, the Soviet Republic of Tajikistan, looking here at the 1970s and the 1980s. And where I'd like to start is with a man named Adil Yakubov. And Adil Yakubov was a very well-known Soviet writer from Uzbekistan. He had a very long and very famous career as a scenarist and as an author of novels and novellas. He also, towards the collapse of the USSR, became a member of the Congress of People's Deputies, which was the new parliamentary body created by Mikhail Gorbachev in the late 1980s. And Adil Yakubov, along with a great number, there were in fact over 2,000 members of this Congress, of other parliamentarians, went to Moscow from 1989 to 1991 to debate the state of the Soviet Union, the state of the Soviet economy, and very many other issues. And in December 1990, Adil Yakubov takes the floor and he starts to talk about the distribution of wealth in the USSR. And he says everyone keeps getting up and claiming that their republic is providing more to the so-called common pot than the other republics and receiving less than everyone else is receiving. And he says, this reminds me of a story that we used to tell about Hoja Nasreddin. And this is a story, and he says, where a few poor fellows would gather together to cook plov. One would buy meat, another sheep, fat, a third rice, and the last, who was absolutely broke, would bring a few onions. The feast of the hungry was overseen by the dervish Hoja Nasreddin, and everyone agreed everyone would eat equally. But it frequently happened that the one who brought garlic would try to wolf down more than the one who had brought meat. And then Hoja Nasreddin would smack him over the head with a wooden spoon. Today, Yakubov said, Hoja Nasreddin's method won't work. You hit your neighbor with the spoon and he'll get you with a ladle. What's the solution? We need to remove the Stalinist secrecy from statistics. Every nation wants to know the truth about its contribution to the union budget in terms of real world prices for bread, gasoline, coal, and cotton. And then it will be immediately clear who is subsidized and who is not. So Yakubov says we're talking about subsidizing, we talk about where money is going, but we don't actually have any numbers, what is going on. So the background discourses that Yakubov is speaking about are two. One, there's a discourse coming from Russia primarily and the Baltic states. And this is a discourse that says throughout the USSR and the history of the USSR, the well-developed, primarily Slavic republics have overwhelmingly subsidized the less developed republics. They have sent a huge number of tax and other revenues, and they have not received back nearly as much as they are sending to Central Asian and Caucasian and other republics. I have a picture here of Yeltsin, who's at a factory in St. Petersburg. He would later visit other factories in 1990, 91, and he would continue to state this argument. You know, he would say that half of the tax revenues collected in the Russian Republic were sent to others, primarily Central Asian republics, and that the overall balance was clearly in favor of the less developed republics. So this is part of what Yakubov had in mind when he was speaking. There's another half of the discourse, and this is the discourse that comes out in the same years from Central Asia. I have here a man named Tohir Abdujabor, who is one of the first and most successful in the last years of the USSR opposition politicians from Tajikistan. And Abdujabor was an economist, and in his platform, as he ran for office in the 1990 elections in Tajikistan for the Supreme Soviet there, as well as later, was that Tajikistan should be economically independent, that it should control its cotton and other resources, and it should be able to sell them on the world market. And Abdujabor said if we did that, we would make back far more than we have ever gotten from the Soviet center. You can hear similar statements from the leaders of Uzbekistan. Gayrat Kadyrov, who was the chairman of the Council of Ministers in 1989, stated at a Politburo meeting then that the Uzbek Republic was providing 70 billion rubles of value through cotton production to the Soviet budget and receiving only 1 billion in return in subsidies. So you have two very divergent discourses at the time. You have one that is clearly indicating value is going to Central Asia overwhelmingly as quote unquote subsidies, and you have an alternative that says, no, we get very little in comparison to what we provide to the center in terms of raw resources. It should be said neither of these figures, the half of the Russian tax revenue or the 70 billion rubles, bears any resemblance to reality in any way that I or anyone else has been able to determine. It's essentially hyperbole. It does, however, represent the broader heightening of tension in the USSR at the time between, say, 89 and 91, and the particular focus, emotional and otherwise, on the place of material resources and budget transfers. Right? So this is a very emotional discourse, and it's one that finds reflection in these sort of hyperbolic statements. The USSR collapses in 91. These discourses do not. They remain, and in fact, they remain parallel to one another. So here I have a picture of a World Bank document from 1993. And this is a document that was intended to provide us base level statistics on most of the states of the former USSR, and it did so by drawing largely upon Soviet statistics and interviews with statisticians in the republics. This particular report argues that Tajikistan was quote unquote subsidized to the degree of 45% of its budget and probably its economy as well, although it's somewhat implicit on that count. And it has similar numbers for many other Central Asian republics. This number, 45%, has since become sort of accepted in terms of Tajikistan's place within the Soviet financial structure, right? So that its budget was 45% subsidized is a figure you will see very frequently in the literature, with citation to other secondary literature, which if you track it far enough will get you to this World Bank document. And this is generally applied whole scale to the rest of the Soviet Central Asian republics. They're overwhelmingly subsidized. They received far more from the center than they gave back. And you see this both in Russian academic literature today and Western, which tends to have accepted the idea of a subsidized Central Asia. On the other hand, you have a discourse that draws upon the late Soviet Central Asian discourse of material extraction and the idea that the value of the actual material resources, if they were calculated in world prices, would have been much greater than the so-called subsidy. This dovetails very well with a post-Soviet academic literature on the colonial nature of Soviet rule in Central Asia. And it focuses on the center-driven policies that created and promoted and continued the cotton monoculture, for example, in Tajikistan or Uzbekistan and partially in Turkmenistan, and the fact that the Central Asian economies were not allowed essentially to direct any of the financial flows going in and out, right? So this seems to align very well with the idea of vast material extraction and the need to consider world prices when talking about material resources coming from Central Asia and their value to the Soviet Union as a whole. So we essentially have the continuation of these two late Soviet discourses, right? On the one hand, that Central Asia is greatly subsidized, on the other hand, that it's exploited. And they exist parallel to one another. They don't speak to one another. In large part, there is no in-depth statistical analysis. There's little economic data that's provided. Some of the attempts in the early 90s to discuss what the economic data might be either concluded that it was impossible, others concluded that any use of world market prices simply led to obscure or simply absurd results. I've tried to recreate some of them, and you do end up in strange and obscure places where, say, the quote unquote real value of Tajik cotton comes out at 0, which seems not true. So it's quite difficult, right? We have these two discourses. There's not much to do with one another, and they don't seem to have any way of resolving their disagreements. And so essentially we remain in the kitchen with Hoja Nasreddin. This is a picture of a number of different nations eating plov that's from the satirical magazine Mullah Nasreddin, which was published in various places in the Caucasus, Tbilisi and Baku and so forth, in the beginning of the 20th century. And this picture clearly has nothing to do with Soviet subsidies, but it seems representative of the quandaries that we have. So we remain in the kitchen, we can't get out. There seems little resolution. So what did I propose to do? I suggested we stop talking about market prices. And I want to suggest that using world prices is a red herring, and it's a misleading attempt to find quote unquote real value. Instead, I'd like to suggest that we think of the USSR as a financial transfer union. We think of it as a closed monetary system where money is moving between budgets and money is moving between federal units. And we try to consider value within this financial transfer union in terms of the union itself. So consider value to the USSR in ruble terms, right? So rather than try to calculate the quote unquote real or market value of cotton in any particular year and how this may or may not relate to the ruble value of the cotton provided, we instead ask what was the value of the material resources provided to the Soviet center in Soviet terms and in terms of its budget and economic value in that particular year. And I say we do this for a couple of reasons. One, of course, the market values lead nowhere and essentially are, leave us with an uncalculable situation. Two, the discourse of subsidies or extraction occurred in terms of ruble values and calculated on the basis of the non-market prices used in the USSR, right? So if we're going to try to reevaluate subsidies or their lack thereof, we should do it in the economic terms that they were initially argued. And in terms of the Soviet Union, the real value of any particular good, practically speaking, was the value that it brought to the budget, whether or not that was in tax or export or other revenue. So really within the system, we're going to be using Soviet ruble values, non-market values. And this within the closed system of the USSR should, I hope, allow us to reevaluate the direction of money. I do know that I'm hammering this point home, but I do so because it is often a point of contention. And I'm happy, of course, to come back to it in the discussion, right? Whether or not we can use non-market values in a way that provides us an interesting answer. But that's what I'm doing here, it should be said, and I'm doing so explicitly. So what do we need to do to think about the USSR as a sort of financial transfer union? One, we need to think about where there are direct transfers, right? So there are monies moving from the Central Soviet budget to a particular Republican budget. In our case, the Tajik Republican budget. We need to think about what is the overall movement of monies, right? Monies and financial transfers are not happening only directly from the Soviet budget, the Central Soviet budget to the Republican budget, but they're also occurring indirectly through various capital investments and movements of salaries, and anything directed from a central ministry going to a Republican economy will have been an essential indirect transfer. And this can be calculated by looking at the total value, essentially, of goods and services purchased or spent or utilized in a Republican territory versus the total value of all goods and services produced. Right, this is what the USSR called the national income utilized, that is used, versus the national income produced. Right, so you can find the divergence between these two numbers, which gives you a sort of total overall potential subsidy or indirect transfer number. This latter number includes the amount that would come through direct budget transfers. So that's the direction, the first direction, money going from the Central Soviet budget to the Republican budget. And the second step is to calculate the tax and export revenue of material resources going from the Republican budget to the central, or from the Republican economy, I apologize, to largely the Central Soviet budget, but also economy. So these are the things that I need to essentially find in order to make the case that I want to make, that we can reevaluate these transfers. One point should also be said here. The broader argument I'm making is related to Central Asia and the other republics, not just Tajikistan, but this paper focuses on Tajikistan. It does so in part because that is the data that I have the greatest access to. It does so also because Tajikistan appears to have had far less economic mismanagement in the 80s when compared to, say, Uzbekistan, and the numbers produced then and available in archives seem to reflect reality to a greater degree. So I think there's a bit more reliability of the statistics for Tajikistan than perhaps other republics. But again, we can get into that later as necessary. So we have two essential flows we need to pay close attention to. One is the going into the Tajik economy and those going out. Luckily, the amount of money going into the Tajik economy is relatively available through published and archival statistics. It's not so difficult to get at. So you can look at the actual budget transfers going from the Central Soviet budget to the Republican budget in the 70s and 80s. It tends to be between 5 and 10%. There's a spike, in the 80s where it will go up a little bit, and we'll go into detail about that later. It's certainly not the 45% that the World Bank had calculated. And more broadly, looking at the total difference between economic value or income used in the Republic versus the amount of income produced, we can see that, but this is looking at the total income used overall versus the percentage of transfers each year. Transfers also are ranging between, say, 5 and at its highest 20%. In some years, they're much lower than others. So there's a sort of wave up and down of the total value additionally provided to the subsidy amount, right? So this is the amount that was generally referred to by Yeltsin and others in the central government about the subsidy. And this particularly difference between national income produced and national income used is sort of the max difference that we want to keep in mind as potential subsidy. So going back, we still have to figure out value for the Soviet center. Tajikistan also is a bit simpler of a case than many other republics in the sense that it had one major resource that was not being properly calculated into its economic statistics, and this is cotton. And cotton plays a particular role, we know, in Central Asia in the Soviet economy, especially in Tajikistan. It's in fact the largest single product of the republic. It's also a product that has a particular place in the Soviet tax structure. So Republican budgets receive a lot of their funding from a tax that's called turnover tax or nalog s oborota. And turnover tax is a tax levied against final consumer goods. It's not levied against material inputs, raw materials, foodstuffs, and a variety of other goods, but clothing, prestige goods, home goods, cars, right? The vast majority of final produced consumer goods has turnover tax applied to it. In many cases, you don't see a vast divergence between where initial raw materials for the production of consumer goods come from and those consumer goods' actual production. So let's say you have iron mining in the Ukraine or in Russia. The production of final, say, pots and pans and consumer goods from that iron will also largely occur in that same republic. And so the turnover tax will be levied on the final production of the consumer good in that republic, and then the Republican budget will get its share of the tax. Cotton, however, and especially in the case of Tajikistan, doesn't fall into this structure. So 90% of all, or thereabouts 90%, it changed very little from year to year, but in the range of 90%, of Tajik cotton was taken outside of the republic to be processed into consumer goods elsewhere. Which meant that all of the turnover taxes were levied on the final goods, not on the initial cotton. And so you have a divergence, right? So you're pulling apart of where the cotton is farmed and harvested and where it is produced into cloth and where the taxes are levied. So these taxes, which are actually 25 to 30% of the Tajik budget, right, without the cotton cloth, right, are not being sent to the Tajik budget, and therefore potentially the largest single producer of tax value for the Republican budget is not being allocated to that budget, but instead to other budgets, Russia or Ukraine or elsewhere where cotton clothing and cotton cloth is being produced. You also have export of cotton, right? Cotton is an export item throughout most of the USSR. And the USSR makes a large amount of currency as well as trading its partners in Eastern Europe for various deficit goods. So right, there's a great deal of value going to the USSR from the export of cotton as well. But this is not calculated in any way that goes back to the Republican budget or the Republican economy. So these are two places where you would need to track down the actual value of Tajikistan. Luckily, I was not the first person to think of this. And in the late 1980s, economists in the Tajik branch of Gosplan, or the state planning body, also decided that the real quote unquote value of cotton for the Soviet budget and economy ought to be calculated. So this is a picture actually from the 1970s. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good one from the 1980s, but it is Gosplan in Dushanbe. They decided to sit down and think about how they could calculate this. So they thought, okay, we have a certain amount of cotton that is being produced. This so raw cotton, right? The amount of cotton you pick up off of the plants is then processed into lint cotton, which is the cotton that then is further processed and woven and turned into yarn and cloth and so forth. A certain proportion of the lint cotton will remain in the Tajik Republic. It's about 10%, right? It's not very great, but the vast majority is sent to other Soviet republics. These go to textile factories. Those textile factories make cotton cloth. Some of that will never be taxed. Some of it will be taxed. The tax then stays, we know, in, say, the Russian or the Ukrainian or other Republican budgets, as well as the Central Soviet budget. Okay, but how much of that should have actually gone to the Tajik Republican budget? So they said, well, we need to look at the actual tax rate on the amount of cotton cloth produced, which they found. And then they said, well, what we're going to do is think about how much of the labor that went into producing the cloth occurred on the territory of the Tajik Republic. And according to the Gosplan calculations, that was 57%. And we'll come back to that number in a minute. But what they're getting at is an underlying assumption in Soviet economics, which is that value comes from labor, right? And the Marxist theory of value is a labor theory of value that says the value of a product is either the real value, the labor value, or the market sort of price value. The latter value is arbitrary and has no relation, in fact, to the quote real value. But the real value is the cost of inputs multiplied by a certain percentage, but multiplied essentially by the amount of labor that goes in. So we had labor and inputs, and we get the real value. And in fact, when the turnover tax was instituted in the beginning of the command economy, it was meant as a tax on surplus value, or прибавочный продукт, which can only come from the application of labor, according to Marxist theory. So the turnover tax is a tax on the additional value that comes from the application of labor to a product. Ergo, as the Gosplan argued, if you're going to divvy it up on the amount of labor that goes into it. So think about the overwhelming number of hours that it takes to seed a cotton field, take care of the cotton field, raise the cotton plants, harvest the cotton plants, pack it up, ship it. Compare that to the amount that goes involved in later processing, ginning, weaving, dyeing, etc. And they said, well, 57% of the total labor hours are those in the territory of the Tajik Republic. Sorry, do I have a sense of how much time I have? I don't have a clock in front of me.
Well, if you can start wrapping up, that would be great. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'll have to move quickly then. I apologize. I probably got stuck a little bit too much on the logistics here. At any rate, so they said, well, what we're going to do is we're going to calculate using that percentage how much value should have been allocated back to our budget and therefore our economy. As I said before, one of the places where value would come was actually export and not only the taxes. And so in my work to sort of check and verify the schematic set out by the Tajik Gosplan office, I've added in the value of exports, right, and the percentage of export that would have come from Tajik cotton. And so you'll see that the calculation becomes a little more complicated. Right, so we need to cut out the export first and then calculate the total amount of taxes. However, that all being said, using the schematic that was set out by Gosplan and which I've been able to verify in terms of finding the various tax rates for the 1970s and 1980s and working to verify the amount, the percentile of labor that should be assigned to the Tajik Republic and so forth, we can calculate the total amount of value from tax revenue and export revenue from Tajik cotton each year. Right? So this creates, and you can see from this chart, a large amount of value. The total uncalculated, right, ranges 300 to 500 or 600 million rubles a year. And if we compare this to what the total subsidy was each year, we can then see that in some years it's less, but it reduces the subsidy significantly. And in other years, it's a great deal, in fact, more, and shows that if we use these calculations, the Tajik Republic appears to be providing more value to the Soviet center than it's in fact getting back in direct and indirect transfers in this closed system of a financial transfer union that I've suggested. We can also look at these in a sort of graphical format. My recalculation is in yellow, which shows the number moving up and down over zero. Right, so each year we may or may not have a deficit or a surplus in terms of value going to the overall Soviet economy or value coming to the Tajik economy in return. The green line is the line really just showing the difference between national income produced and national income used in Tajikistan without any calculation. And there's another calculation here by a man named Bert van Selm, who's one of the few to also try to consider this, but he used a combination of internal and market prices and ended up somewhere not dissimilar from the official consideration. But he was not considering, in fact, the value of cotton going to the central budget and economy, which I think really creates the significant difference here. And so I'll end with a very few remarks. One of the interesting things about this data, having recreated it, is that I keep changing my mind what it means. I've been looking at it for a number of years and trying to figure out exactly what the implications are. I do think one clear implication is that any level of subsidization of Central Asia is much lower than has been suggested in Western literature, but also in late Soviet discourses, right? We don't see massive subsidization. Even using the official national income utilized, national income produced divergence, the level of subsidy is lower than that for certain United States states, or similar to the subsidies, quote unquote, or the transfers provided to certain states of the European Union from wealthier and more developed states of the European Union, right? So in fact, that in and of itself looks like a fairly standard distribution or redistribution of wealth within a financialized economic system. On the other hand, does this say anything about the colonial nature of the USSR? This is a little more mixed, right? On the one hand, you don't see a massive expropriation of wealth in terms of the monies being directed back and forth. It's often actually, if you look at the median or the average value, it's close to zero, right? So it seems to balance out year to year. 1 year will be a little more value to Tajikistan, 1 year a little more value in the other direction. On the other hand, this doesn't cancel out any of the very clearly colonial aspects of Soviet rule from being centrally directed and being basically organized as a financial system for the benefit of Moscow, not for the benefit of Central Asia. The lack of industrialization and the cotton monoculture and all of these things go nowhere. So it's harder to say this has a direct impact on that discourse. Finally, one thing that I do think is interesting is if you compare the level of surplus or deficit to changes in cotton production and world cotton prices, you can actually see that these things track. So in years where there would be a greater surplus, say that the Tajik Republic was providing more value to the Soviet center, would be a year generally in higher cotton prices and higher production, whereas when it was receiving more back from the Soviet Center when it had a deficit, would be a year of lower world prices on cotton and lower production. So what it looks like in many ways is not a redistribution system within a financial transfer system, but instead a way of risk sharing against market and production shocks, which is quite interesting because, in fact, this is one of the things that financial transfer unions worldwide intend to do. But it's something that runs very contrary to what the stated goals of the USSR were, which were to equalize and redistribute wealth. So in fact, what they're doing seems to be a more effective version of what capitalist financial transfer unions had intended to do, which I find somewhat ideologically curious. So on that note, thank you very much. I apologize for running over on time, and I look forward to the discussion very much.
Thank you so much, Isaac. Fascinating. Without further ado, let me invite the audience to start placing questions in the Q&A or in the chat, better Q&A, and give the floor to Professor Gleason. Greg, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nargis. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion. It's a very important discussion. And Isaac, I just want to applaud your choice to focus on this important and difficult issue. I think that you've described the thinking with respect to distributive policy very well in your presentation here and also in the article, which I enjoyed reading. And I'm particularly impressed by your drawing attention to the issue of risk sharing, the issue of the particular policy which you've analyzed as leading us to more insight into risk sharing than into distributive policy. Of course, distributive policy is very important in any communist or socialist way of looking at the world. Typically, socialist theory thinks in terms of equity and to some extent in terms of equitable outcomes, equivalent sometimes outcomes, ravensva, so to speak. And I think that it's a very good choice that you've made to analyze this case study, basically, of Tajikistan. Tajikistan is a country of great importance in the former Soviet space, although it's small, physically small. It has a very rapidly growing population right now, but it's also a country with deep roots and rich traditions. I was in Hoja in northern Tajikistan in 1994, and I recognized that they were celebrating the 2,500th anniversary of the city. So it does have deep roots without any question. And cotton, of course, is an important issue. It's today, for instance, an agricultural economy that leads Tajikistan. Roughly 60% of the population today works in agriculture, so it's very important in those terms. Also, it's important as we look back into the Soviet period in terms of King Cotton, the role that cotton played. Cotton was what they used to call a strategic commodity. It's not easy, actually, to produce cotton, to produce it efficiently, and it is a so-called technical crop, which involves a great deal of integration. With respect to how the 1970s and the 1980s reflects on the implementation of Soviet economic policy in Tajikistan, I think you've focused on some very good issues, and I'll just say a few things and then open it up for discussions. But let me just say that, I think that when I consider the Soviet experience, I tend to think in terms of three different levels, actually. The first level is, of course, the theoretical level of communist and socialist theory. The second is what actually took place in terms of Moscow's policies with respect to the regions, how Gosplan and the planning apparatus designed to achieve the objectives of the theoretical foundation. And then the third level that I think of is the practitioners themselves working on a day-to-day basis with carrying out the kinds of challenges that they had, whether it was in agriculture or in cotton production or in some other area. And I think that when we talk today about the post-Soviet world and the Soviet experience, we oftentimes think about it in terms of the relations between center and periphery. That's oftentimes the discussion. People think in terms of the so-called colonial model and the consequences of colonialism, and we sometimes apply that to our discussion of the post-Soviet space. But when you visualize it, from the point of view of the Soviet Union, the center-periphery model or image makes much more sense, because basically what you have in the Soviet period is the Moscow at the center and spokes radiating to all the regions, all the 14 other republics, and then all the regions within those regions. So the center-periphery approach does make sense. But, you know, I have to, and this is the only point that I will make with respect to this subject. It's not a criticism, it's just an observation. And that is that I don't think that accounting is actually a science. I think it's a process. And when I look at the data that was produced and analyzed during the Soviet period, what I tend to see is an accounting system. It is a logical system, it makes sense, and it works for its purposes, but it's different, I think, than science. And what brought me to that conclusion? A long time ago, I was working as an intern on an internship at the Institute of Economics in Moscow in 1989, 1990. And one of the colleagues that I was working with, we were having a theoretical discussion. Then I began asking her about her own financing of her own professional development. And she talked about things, and then she said, but you know, in the end, you actually do need some money. And for me, that was 180 degrees of what I thought about. What she saw in her own professional development was that access was much more important than cash. I think in the Western world, we tend to see cash as primarily important, but this actually reflects what the thinking was in Dushanbe as well. It wasn't so much the cash. They weren't going to get the money from the export sales, the revenues from cotton. What they were going to get is influence and access. That is what really drove the system, it seems to me. So when I think about the situation today, you know, you can ask the question. I talked to many of my Soviet era colleagues, and they say, well, we didn't actually get the Soviet system right. You know, if we had done it differently, it would have worked out better. Now that we have almost 3 decades of capitalism, or so-called capitalism, in Central Asia, I think it's clear we didn't get the capitalism right. The market's not working either. So I think we have to look back at some of the issues. And I think that Yakubov's observations with respect to Nasreddin are very appropriate. I'm glad you brought that up. Thanks for your analysis.
Thank you very much. Isaac, do you want to respond to that briefly? And then we'll move to Q&A.
Thank you very much, Professor Gleason. And you know, most of that was very kind, and so I just want to say thank you. And I appreciate very much the sort of broader background and context you provided. What I would want to say in terms of the non-cash value, right, of material resources within the Soviet system, this is a very important point, right? So, like, we know that the Soviet economy runs in many ways on the distribution and the exchange of non-monetary goods and services, right? Things that have literally no monetary value and are not expected to have any monetary value, but that have a great deal of societal value, right? And these are things that, you know, would give you access to vacations, or things that would give your children access to better schools, or summer camps, or particular goods that were hard to get at, which literally had no cash value because they couldn't be bought. They could only be gotten in various ways. And I think it's a very important point on the level of Republican-center relations to think of this too. In fact, one of the things that I would really love to study, and that I don't think anyone has ever studied, are the Republican representative offices in Moscow, right? So each republic had it's like представительство республики, right? Sitting in Moscow, right? A representative office. And interestingly, in many cases in 91, these offices, in late 91, beginning of 92, these offices, their buildings, their staffs, etc., became the embassies overnight, right? So they're already acting in some way as a conduit between, and you will hear many stories about people coming from Dushanbe going to the representative office, and that representative officer, depending upon his level of access, getting them things that they want, right? So this is a very important conduit that hasn't been studied very well at all. In terms of cotton, I don't think anybody ever expected to get this money back. I think what they wanted to do with these calculations was to demonstrate in the face of arguments like those made by Yeltsin, that we are not just taking, right? We are also providing, so that the resources that we get in a non-monetary sense are justified. It seems to be, you know, there's justification going back and forth in both ways at the final years of the USSR. And this seems to be, right, it's very, again, emotional and angry and so forth. But before things start to break down, right, there is this sort of assumed, you know, we're going to give a certain amount of material value and we will get a certain amount of other value back, but it might not be money. I agree entirely.
Excellent. Okay, we don't have much time and we have some really excellent questions. Let me cluster them. Well, the first set of questions, let's see how many sets we can do. But the first, I want to start with actually my own question, what you were saying about the kind of the conduit that existed with the Republican representatives and, you know, in Moscow, and, you know, how these things were negotiated. How active were kind of these national representatives, and how active were Republican bureaucrats in trying to reform at this center republic economic relations in the second half of the 80s? So basically, when, you know, the new Union Treaty was negotiated, when these kind of relations were put on the were discussed, and to what extent statistics was used in these negotiations. You started your discussion with Odil Yakubov's quote and his criticism of, you know, you cannot discuss the value of cotton without really using statistics. So how important was statistics? And kind of relevant to that, I was surprised by your note that Tajik statistics was quite honest, actually, and well, fairly good, it seems. So that would be one question. Then we had the question about indirect support of Central Asian countries from the USSR, so-called Moskovskое обеспечение. So these are cities directly funded from USSR budget funding. There are few cities in uranium digging areas. Would these funds make much to change your findings? That's one question. The other question is, what is the economic settlement between Russia and Tajikistan in the post-Soviet? Actually, let's leave it for later. And okay, it's not clear to me whether wages and the input costs were subtracted from export revenues of cotton. Some of the inputs, such as irrigation water, was even priceless, but others, such as fertilizers, were subsidized as well. Also, some of the projects, such as large infrastructure projects, were financed directly from the USSR budget. Have you factored those into your calculations? So that's a bunch. I know it's a challenge, but if you can give very relatively brief answers, that would be great.
Well, to the last two questions, these are similar, right? So we're looking at capital investiture projects, which come from Moscow. These are anything from, in Tajikistan, Orogun, which is being built from the 70s on, to you know, the Tajik aluminum factory, which requires a great deal of investiture, which without providing a lot of return until much later. And things like Moskovskое обеспечение, right? So looking at cities that get direct subsidization, essentially, right? In that case, you know, to places like Taboshar, right? If we're talking about a plutonium mining city, or Kharog even also, right? Because it's an outlying city that needs support to exist, essentially gets, you know, Moskovskое обеспечение. Both of these categories would be covered in the difference between national income utilized and national income produced. And these are statistics that are essentially verifiable. They were produced by the Central Statistics Administration in Moscow. They've also been somewhat independently remodeled by Western statisticians, and that showed the difference in the total amount monies basically spent, right, in a republic and the total value produced, right? So the Moskovskaya обеспечение means people have more money, they're spending it, right? So it's money coming in that gets calculated into national income utilized. In the same way the capital transfers, right? Anything coming from Moscow or any other republic, right, goes into that calculation, right? So these things are covered by the difference between the two, right? So the sort of total max possible subsidy difference between NIU and NIP. The question of export value versus the costs, such as salaries and irrigation and so forth. The costs associated with producing cotton are already built into the national income produced and the national income utilized. What I want to say with export revenues simply is that there were rubles or dollars or francs or other current currency that we can express in ruble value that was coming into the budget that is not being calculated, right? So the cost of production were being calculated. The costs of sale, or the value of sale being made that brought value back to overcome partly that cost of production, were not. So the point of that calculation is not to think about the absolute value or real value of cotton inputs versus value acquired on the market, but simply to say how much money is getting back to the budget from cotton that's not otherwise being calculated. In terms of your sort of longer questions, Nargis, so how active are Tajik bureaucrats in trying to change this discourse and the center-periphery relations? In the latter part of the 1980s, not very much. And especially in the last years of the USSR, they're caught in a bit of a contradiction where they want to support Gorbachev in the center, but Gorbachev keeps telling everybody essentially be independent, be self-sufficient, take more Republican economic authority. So they don't want that, but they have to support Gorbachev, so they have to want it and they don't know what to do. And so people like Makamov, the president of Tajikistan from 1990 on, and previously the leader or the first secretary of the Tajik Communist Party, really doesn't like it, but he doesn't say anything about it. And he doesn't pick up the discourse from his own Gosplan and the statistics being produced there. On the other hand, you have a completely Russian serving discourse about the world market value of oil and gas that's produced by Russian Gosplan and Russian statistical agencies, which is then published and cited and made very public, which seems to imply that, again, Russia is producing much more value than it's getting back, because it specifically looks at certain very expensive export products. So Russia is very effective at using this discourse. The Central Asian republics are not. And I think this has to do with the particular paradox that they're stuck in vis-a-vis Gorbachev and their views on the collapsing Soviet state. How honest were the statistics being produced in Tajikistan? This is often a point of contention. I think, and this goes back to what Professor Gleason was saying, within the system of Soviet accounting, right, we need to think about, people are not, Soviet statisticians in general, with exceptions, of course, were not there to falsify numbers. They were there to try to represent reality. And I think that there are clear exceptions. Uzbekistan, we know in the 1980s up to 1984, perhaps, maybe not afterwards, is an exception to this, right? There are other exceptions. But Tajikistan, in fact, has a big external accounting of its cotton books at the end of the 1980s, because the same investigators who were locking people up in Uzbekistan for falsifying cotton production go to Tajikistan because they assume, of course, well, it's all the same from Moscow's perspective. And in fact, they can't find anybody to lock up, which is impressive because they were arresting and locking up thousands of people who had no evidence against them in Uzbekistan. It seems like they couldn't find evidence at all of misrepresentation in Tajikistan, although they were trying. And you have various statements coming from people like Alexander Yakovlev and others who really don't have any love lost for Tajikistan, but are willing to say that, in fact, the accounting system is more or less, in his words, clean. So I think in this particular case, there's good reason to think that they're not any worse than any other statistics.
Okay, great. Greg, do you want to add anything to that? And then we'll take one more question.
Yeah, I think that Isaac, I agree with your comments with respect to Tabashar. There's also the facility that was called Chkalovsk in Hoja. And I don't think that those figures actually were ever represented in Tajik Republican financial statistics. I think those were union figures. The numbers would never show up in Tajikistan. That's just my interpretation.
Okay, and let me squeeze in two more questions. One is, to what degree should we price in the devastating negative externalities of cotton production in Central Asia? That is the damage to water basins and the massive damage from chemical fertilizers and pesticides. And the second question is, where did the 1993 calculations concerning 45% go wrong? Could you discuss the specific aspects about the 1993 calculations that led to the incorrect findings? And I want to assure the audiences that we'll have another event dealing with the early 90s. Okay, so okay, please, Isaac.
Okay, very quickly then, I'll go backwards. So the World Bank calculations calculate things like pension payments and socio-economic, right? So payments to those who are disabled as transfers. But the people who were receiving them would also have that this is a Republican essentially, or a union-wide budget where they pay into it, right, and then they get back. So why these are considered direct transfers, I don't know. And it seems to throw off the calculation. There's a number of these things where people receiving money in any way that's linked to the center is automatically assumed to be a transfer. However, I think that the more important calculation rather than the budget is the difference between national income utilized and national income produced, because it really shows the difference in value. Right, the budget is only 35 to 40% of the economy. That's a great deal, right? But it's not even a majority, right? So if the national income produced and used includes the budget numbers, right? So this is sort of the end figure we want to talk about as a total possible subsidy. The cost of monoculture and ecology and the devastation that really occurs as a result of this over 70 years in Tajikistan and elsewhere in Central Asia. This does need to be calculated. I don't know of any way to do it in numerical terms, but I think the important thing here, and this is why I say that my numbers probably have less impact on the colonial discourse and the consideration of Central Asia as a colonial holding of the USSR, is that this only shows one piece of the picture, right? We're talking about what are the financial transfers within the financial transfer union, not considering what the massive side effects may be. And those side effects are enormous, and they probably push us in a direction to say that even if the numbers are even if Tajikistan is getting back a little bit more, this is not a good deal for Tajikistan. But that's a different story, right? This is the different, it's not about expropriation directly of wealth, it's about the consequences of that expropriation. And I think it changes the discourse. But again, like I said, I don't think that the numbers that I have really impact that discourse as much as they do about the discourse of subsidization. And one final point on Tabashar, I have no way of proving this, so we're going to speculate, but I think Moskovskaya обеспечение is going into the difference between NIU and NIP simply because the numbers that I take for that are taken from Moscow, not from Tajikistan. I agree, in Tajikistan, they essentially wouldn't see it. But if CISU, right, if the Central Statistics Agency is looking at overall divergence, it would theoretically include these things without specifying them, right, because they were secret in various ways. But you may be right. I mean, this is a further calculation that probably should be made, but I'm not sure how to do it.
Well, okay, definitely more can be discussed in this regard. You were so efficient in answering. Let me squeeze in one more question. The last one, really the last one for now. In 1960s, 1970s, Soviet republics have been bargaining the inputs to their republics. In this context, Tajikistan was weaker than Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Would you assume, therefore, transfers to Tajikistan stayed lower? So the power factor.
I mean, this is an interesting question, right? So there's a broader question, which is how much can we apply my findings on Tajikistan to other Central Asian republics? Mm-hmm. And I don't have a good answer to that. I like to think that it shows something about the broader perspective of Moscow planning towards Central Asia, that it implies an interest not in the stated goal of equalization or equitable distribution of outcomes, but in fact, an attempt to share risks across a federal system, right? Of course, for the benefit of Moscow. And I think that relationship we can apply on a broad level to Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan. In terms of the actual value of monetary and non-monetary capital investments and so forth, goods that are sent to each republic, I do think in many ways you probably see more to other republics. You can actually see on the case of Kazakhstan that looking at the divergence between national income produced and national income used, it's much higher percentile-wise than any other Central Asian republic. So the closer links between the Kazakh party figures and the Central Party figures, I think clearly has an impact. I haven't looked as closely at Uzbekistan, but you probably would see a slight, similarity there. These are also republics that produce significantly larger variety of raw materials, right? We're looking at, and things that have great value on the export market and, value to strategic elements of the Soviet economy. So the calculations there are much more complicated. They probably involve much higher volumes in both directions. And it may be much harder to really see a similar balance. I don't know. I'd be very curious to expand this, but it's of course, a much larger project.
Thank you. Greg, do you have any thoughts on this or insights on this issue?
No, I agree with Isaac.
Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan. Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you so much. I think it was a very enlightening session. I learned a lot. Thank you so much, our dear panelists, and thank you so much, the audiences, for tuning in. Goodbye.